Yeah, I travel.
Okay. So, what I'd like for us to do is to recap briefly about the synoptic problem. Right, there are a few people who weren't here last time who might benefit from that, and there are a few things that we didn't get to discuss in as much detail, perhaps. And then move on to the Gospel of John. And after that, we can have some discussion and see if we can want to do any comparing of some of the major themes among the Gospels. I want to make sure that we at least cover the broad brushstrokes of it first. So, just as a recap, what is the synoptic problem? It's the question of the relationship between the first three Gospels. Right? So they're called the Synoptic Gospels probably for two reasons. The real reason is that there's a thing you can get called a synopsis of the Gospels, which will present the Gospels in columns. Right? And so you can see where two of them overlap, almost word for word in passages. Three of them overlap, right? Where there are differences and divergences, where there's large-scale agreement of order. But synoptic comes from a Greek term, right? You can get the optic part probably, right? Seeing with like one eye. And so considered together with the Gospel of John, right? Matthew, Mark, and Luke are much more similar to each other than any of them is the Gospel of John, right? And so together with the overlap, there's a commonality of perspective. They tend to have the same kind of broad structure, contents in general. And we looked at last time that there's word-for-word agreement, not only in some of the things that Jesus is reported to have said, like you'd expect people to pay close attention to that, repeat it over and over, get fixed in a certain form, and maybe could be remembered even orally. But even when it comes to narrator's comments, right, like let the reader understand, or he turned and said to the paralytic, or things like that. And when we look at the overview, right, we'll see that the Gospels largely run in parallel in terms of the contents, right? The stories that are told, the parables that are included, the details that are included. So not just in individual passages or stories, but throughout the course of the Gospels, there's large-scale agreement. And it's often very hard for people in our time to think themselves back into a time when most people couldn't read. Right? And so we can memorize things. Right? You probably memorized a poem or something. Maybe people don't do that anymore, but presumably some of you at least have done something like that. But can you imagine trying to memorize something word for word without a text? In fact, the whole notion of word for word would become meaningless in that context, right? It might be the same story, but when there's no written text to check it against, and obviously no videotaping or other ways of capturing it, when memory is all that there is, there's a limit to what the human memory can recall verbatim. Right? And so when we see large-scale agreement and lengthy verbatim agreement, word for word, we can be fairly confident that it's a sign that there's a literary relationship. So one or more of these authors copied from the other. And the question of who copied from whom is the challenging one. And last time, right, we took a look at a bunch of examples. We won't go through them again. We saw that there are some places where the agreement is substantial, right? The differences are minor, and it seems like one of them may have just copied from the other, or two of them may have copied from the third. There are other places where there are significant differences, right? The two different versions of the Lord's Prayer, the sign of Jonah. And there are places where it seems like they may have heard the same story at some point in the past, but they're not drawing one on the other's literary account. There are differences between the accounts of the suicide of Judas in Matthew and Acts. In fact, in one of them it's a suicide, in the other it's not at all clear why his guts are spilling out all over the place. But there are divergences which it's hard to explain in terms of one copying the other. Right? If we're looking for a literary relationship and trying to have an explanation entirely in literary terms, then the question of why there are these massive divergences without any real plausible motive for making those changes, it sometimes seems more likely that one of the authors, even if they knew the other one's written work, is substituting a version of the story as they do it. So where Matthew, Mark, Luke agree, it's fairly easy, and most scholars, right, even those who disagree on other things, think Mark was the first of the Gospels. Oftentimes Mark's wording is less polished. Matthew and Luke often improve the grammar. Now, as an educator, I know that it's possible for somebody to use a source that has really, really good grammar, and yet what they produce using that source to not have as good grammar, and so it's not an absolute rule. But we saw examples of Matthew clarifying things, adding comments to explain things, and it doesn't seem likely that Mark, let's say, worked with Matthew and left those out. Right? And so most scholars think that Mark was the one that came first. We could posit that Luke and Matthew used Mark, but then how do we explain the fact that Matthew and Luke agree on things that are in Matthew and Luke but not in Mark? And the Sermon on the Mount is a famous passage in the Gospel of Matthew, and what we find is that in Luke chapter 6 and also some other parts of it in Luke chapter 11, we find some parts of that sermon situated in a different context, but nonetheless the same material, largely in the same order. And so how do we account for the fact that there's this agreement between Matthew and Luke? And when we look at things like the infancy stories, right, which we looked at earlier in the semester, we see that there are these divergences which, again, don't look like one person starting with the other's written work and making deliberate changes. Right? Why rewrite the genealogy? Why change the setting in time? Why change the geographic movement? If we could think of a reason why the author might have done that, then direct literary dependence might seem like the best explanation, and certainly would be simpler. But because it seems like there are these agreements and yet also these divergences, what most scholars think happened is something slightly more complicated. And so here's the consensus solution. Right? But there are major scholars and a sizable minority who are detractors from at least some aspects of this. So most scholars, even the detractors from the other part I'm going to mention, think Mark wrote first, and that Matthew and Luke use Mark. Usually when Matthew diverges from Mark, Luke doesn't. And when Luke diverges from Mark, Matthew doesn't. And so it seems like they were both using Mark's gospel and doing so independently of one another. There are a few exceptions, but for the most part, that seems like what's going on. Since Matthew and Luke have material in common, and yet there are reasons to think they didn't use each other's gospel directly, the consensus view is that Matthew and Luke drew on another source, right? And that's usually referred to by the nickname Q. It's a long story and subject to some debate whether Q is just the next letter that, because they've come up with hypothetical sources for other texts that have used lots of other letters, or whether it actually is supposed to denote the first letter for the first letter of the German word for source, which is Quelle. But whatever the reason, this is the way that most scholars think that the relationship is to be explained. And this is important for trying to make sense of the Gospels and their themes. When we see one of the Gospel authors changing something that was written in their source, it helps us understand what they're trying to emphasize. Right? We saw that in the relationship between Kings and Chronicles, for instance, right? Where Chronicles changes things, redoes things, adds details, drops details. It gives us clues to what the author of Chronicles is trying to emphasize. And so where we can figure out where one author is using another's work, it gives us clues to what they're trying to emphasize by how they use that work. It's also relevant for those who are interested in the historical figure of Jesus, because it means that going back before the time of Matthew and Luke, there were most likely an earlier gospel, the Gospel of Mark, and also a collection written down sometime within a matter of decades of the time of the crucifixion, a record of sayings of Jesus. Right? And that's what Q is thought to have been, a collection of the sayings of Jesus. And so when we look at Matthew, Mark, and Luke, it seems as though there's a literary relationship. Whether it's in terms of one or two copying from a third, two of them using another source that no longer exists, and the reason why it might not have been preserved may simply be that most or all of its contents found their way to Matthew or Luke or both. But it seems like there's a literary relationship. Like there's this exact wording that agrees. When we get to the Gospel of John, things get more puzzling. I mentioned previously that the authorship of the Gospels, the traditional views of the authors, the traditional names assigned to them, is a matter of tradition, right? It's not in our very earliest manuscripts, it's something that's added later. And there's been a lot of debate and discussion about, was the Gospel of Mark really written by somebody named Mark? If so, which Mark? Those kinds of questions. The Gospel of John is an interesting case because it actually has references to a figure who, at the end of the Gospel, is said to be the source of that Gospel. In John chapter 21, I told that Peter turned and saw the disciple whom Jesus loved following them, asks him about his death, explains that there were rumors that he wouldn't die because of what Jesus said, and that, in fact, those rumors were misguided. So presumably by the time that this is being published, that individual has died, and this is explaining that. It says, "This is the disciple who has testified to these things and has written them, and we know that his testimony is true." Verse 24 of John 21. And so, whoever the we is that's putting this gospel into its final form and publishing it, says that this individual either arranged for these things to be written, or wrote them down himself, or in some way was the source for the material in this gospel. If we ask who that individual was, well, the external evidence, right, the traditions of the church suggest it was John, the son of Zebedee, one of the 12 apostles. If we looked only at internal evidence, then it gets interesting, because there is an individual who's referred to as the one whom Jesus loves, a named individual. Does anybody know who that is? And this is like, not like, you should all know this question, this is like Bible trivia. Give yourself a pat on the back for getting it. Kind of question. Yeah.
I mean, I just wrote one of my papers. It starts with a TH, right?
No. Are you thinking of Thomas or?
No.
Or Thaddeus?
No. I read this one doing research for one of my papers. I just know. I thought it started with T.
Lazarus?
No.
No.
Never mind.
Okay.
Peter.
It's not Peter. If we take a look at John chapter 11, we're told that now a certain man was ill, Lazarus in Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. Mary was the one who anointed the Lord with perfume and wiped his feet with her hair. Her brother Lazarus was ill. So the sisters sent a message to Jesus, "Lord, he whom you love is ill." And it's only from that point on that we get references to the disciple whom Jesus loved. And so if we were looking at internal evidence, then we might think that the author might be Lazarus rather than John. There's been a lot of debate, there's been a lot of discussion, and there's not a lot that's certain. And so we're going to do what we usually do and focus on what can we figure out about the author, the context, the emphases from the text itself. Debates about authorship are interesting, but those of you who've done research reports on them will know that you can spend a lot of time looking into them and still not feel like you've got any clear-cut answer. So, if that's the conclusion that you've been drawing in those, then you're probably on the right track. But what do we find in the Gospel of John? What makes it different from the Synoptics? Because it really is different. In fact, I did my doctoral dissertation on the distinctive features of the portrait of Jesus in the Gospel of John, or what in technical terms is called its Christology, right? How it depicts Jesus. I'm starting from a standpoint which many of you may have also experienced of assuming that, well, they're all Gospels in the New Testament, they ought to all pretty much agree and say kind of the same thing. And so once I realized that John really is different, genuinely different, fundamentally different in certain respects, the question of why became interesting to me. And this is one of the reasons why I talk about John using PowerPoint, because if I don't, I can really start talking and we'll never stop. And I know you want me to avoid that as much as I want to avoid that. So, what's different about the Gospel of John? Well, the actual stories that are told are different. Right? Most of what's in the other Gospels is not found in John. There are a few exceptions. Right? There's something that is kind of like the baptism of Jesus, but it's that little bit different. Right? It doesn't explicitly say that John baptized Jesus, although it does mention him seeing the Spirit descend on him. We have the feeding of the 5,000, the crossing of the sea there in the middle, and of course ends with crucifixion, resurrection. But other than that, there are these vast divergences. And some stories that may be familiar, right? The dialogue with Nicodemus, with that famous saying, "You must be born again," found only in the Gospel of John. The story of the wedding in Cana, the Samaritan woman at the well, right? The raising of Lazarus. These are all stories that are found only in the Gospel of John. There's also a different setting. Most of the action takes place in Jerusalem and is focused on Jesus visiting for certain Jewish festivals. And there's a different chronology, right? Because Jesus is said to be doing things during 3 different Passovers, right? That means more than 2 years of public ministry, and most usually say 3. If you had only the Synoptic Gospels, you might not get that Jesus' public activity lasted for any particular length of time, more than a year or less. So the content, the chronology, the setting, these things are different. There's also different language and style. So Mark's Gospel starts with the baptism of John and the activity of John the Baptist. Matthew and Luke both include infancy stories, right? Stories centered around the birth of Jesus. John's Gospel alone starts with, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us." And so that's a really, going back to the beginning in a different sense than the other Gospels are. That notion of Jesus as the Word become flesh, right, is unique to this Gospel. There's an emphasis on light and darkness, ascent and descent. The idea that Jesus pre-existed in heaven and descended, or one who became Jesus pre-existed in heaven, found only in the Gospel of John, one of the canonical Gospels. There are all these sayings where Jesus says, "I am the good shepherd, I am the bread of life, I am the door." And in chapter 8 in particular, these places where he says, "I am," and which might allude to the divine name. So there are these distinctive ways of speaking we find in the Gospel of John. There's irony, misunderstanding, double entendre. Anybody know what that is? Stuff that has 2 meanings, right? And we get this, the Gospel of John seems to like presenting Jesus interacting with other people in this way. Right? Where Jesus will say something, the person will understand it one of the 2 ways it could be understood. Jesus will say, no, you're not getting it, because he means it symbolically and spiritually, and then the dialogue quickly transforms into a monologue in which Jesus talks about himself and his identity in ways that don't overlap with what we find in the Synoptic Gospels, either in terms of the actual conversation or in terms of the way Jesus talks about himself. 2 quick examples, right? The story of Jesus talking to Nicodemus. Jesus says, "You must be born anothen" in Greek, which can mean again or from above. Nicodemus understands it as again, and so says, "How can you go back into your mother's womb and be born a second time?" It doesn't make sense. And Jesus makes clear that he's talking about a birth from the Spirit, a birth from above. Talking with the woman at the well, he says that he can offer living water, which is the Aramaic idiom for flowing water. And so she's like, "How are you going to get water? You don't even have a bucket, the well is deep." And it's like, "No, I'm talking about something else." And so these plays on words, right, with misunderstanding, which leads to Jesus explaining something about himself, who he is, what he's come to do. We can also do some statistical comparison of keywords. Right? Now, 73.2% of all statistics are made up on the spot, including that one. And I'm kidding. When we talk about differences of style, all that can seem very subjective, right? But when we look at actual number of occurrences of words in the Gospel of John compared to the other Gospels, you really get the sense that this Gospel is different, right? It's not just in the eye of the beholder. So here's some comparisons. Jesus talks a lot about the kingdom of God, the kingdom of heaven, most of the time in Matthew's Gospel, but the kingdom, right, is a major focus in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. It's the center point of these parables that Jesus tells. It's central to his preaching. In the Gospel of John, kingdom occurs far less frequently. And how many times exactly depends on some variations in the manuscript. So that's the most generous account. Jesus is talking about himself. Actually, Jesus is focused mostly on the kingdom of God. on God in the Synoptic Gospel. In the Gospel of John, compared to the Synoptics, that I can really see the difference, can't you? 118 times. And if we look at uses of Father and the Father, often paired with the Son, in reference to Jesus, we'll see that even though Matthew clearly went to this terminology of God as Father, and that probably goes back to Jesus, given that we have that Aramaic word for Father used in the Gospels and in Paul's letter to the Galatians and elsewhere, Abba, right? So it's probably drawing on something that Jesus himself said, but John is doing something distinctive with it, emphasizing it in a way that's not found in the other Gospels. And so when we look at the Gospel of John, it really is distinctive, right? The terminology is distinctive, as well as the style, as well as the content, as well as the story. And so the question then becomes, why? What you'll find if you look into the question or the subject of the historical figure of Jesus is that historians very often don't use the Gospel of John as a source of knowledge about the historical figure of Jesus. And you can understand why that would be the case, right? If the words of Jesus in this Gospel are in the author's distinctive style, they differ from other sources that we have, historians are looking for sources that confirm things, right? And here we find the Gospel of John has this distinctive perspective. Some, though, have been making a concerted effort to try to rehabilitate the Gospel of John, not necessarily in terms of the words attributed to Jesus, and we'll see why in a moment, but in terms of its other content, in terms of some of the details about the relationship between Jesus and John the Baptist, other things like that. If we consider it 3 against 1, right, then John loses. But if Matthew, Mark, and Luke agree because there's a literary interdependence, then in some cases it may be really 1 against 1. Right? And so when it comes to something like the chronology or the length of Jesus' ministry, it may be that it's not 3 against 1 in the sense of 3 independent sources versus 1. Right? But one author who wrote and told the story in a certain chronology, which is then followed by Matthew and Luke when they write their Gospel. I'm going to talk to the end of this, and then we'll go back to a little activity to get you to do. As a way of illustrating what's distinctive about the language of this Gospel, right? Punctuation marks, quotation marks, things like that didn't exist in the time when the New Testament documents were written. In this period, we start to get some instances of leaving a space after the equivalent of a sentence or a paragraph, something like that. But as you can see here in this very ancient papyrus, 66, which is from around the year 200, so maybe just a little more than a century, maybe even less than that, after the Gospel was written, one of our earliest New Testament manuscripts. And as you can see, right, it's these capital letters running on. Right? And so there's not even breaks between words, never mind quotation marks or things like that. And so some of you may have seen at some point a red letter edition of the New Testament or something like that, where Jesus' words are placed in red. And one of the things we're going to do in a moment is to get you to ask in small groups, where would you put the quotation mark, right? If you were dealing with the raw text, right, that doesn't have punctuation, how would you figure out which words in this Gospel come from Jesus, which are the words of the narrator, which are words of other people? We'll come back to that in a moment, but let me just finish off and round off the things I want to say about the Gospel of John, and then we can break into small groups. I mentioned that I did my doctoral work on the Gospel of John, so let me just tell you what I focused on. I suggested that the context in which this Gospel is written might be important to understanding why it's different. Now, of course, every Gospel seems to have its own unique context, not completely unique in the sense of unrelated to other Christian movements, but distinctive, right? And so we could explain all Gospel differences in these terms. But if we look at why the portrait of Jesus in the Gospel of John is distinctive, it may be that debates that were going on about the identity of Jesus in the context in which this author wrote, those things might help explain this. So let me draw the question of, why is the Gospel of John distinctive to a close, and we'll round off that discussion, and then we'll look at that earlier question in small groups or fewer. So we talked about apologetics and the fact that very often when somebody's arguing to defend their beliefs, right, then that may be distinct from the kind of scholarship that we're looking for when we're looking for reliable sources. But it's a spectrum, right? And people are always interested in defending their beliefs, right? But most of us at least try to be open to changing our minds about things when new information comes in. One thing that's been seen in the history of religion and the sociological study of religion is that when there's debate about beliefs, the attempt to formulate a response to objections leads the person who's trying to defend their beliefs not just to defend what's already there, but also to elaborate and develop in the process. And so if we look at some of the pieces to the puzzle, what's going on in this gospel and its context, one of the things that's striking is that where other gospels refer to Pharisees, Sadducees, Herodians, various others, the opponents in the Gospel of John are often referred to as the Jews. And this is important to note, not least because there's a terrible history of Christian anti-Semitism that looks back to some of the language that's used in this Gospel. Right? Jesus talking about who the true father of these Jewish opponents are, and saying, you're of your father the devil, and all these things, which certainly have contributed to the anti-Judaism, the anti-Semitism that is an unfortunate part of Christian legacy. But one of the things that's a key to understanding this is that in the Gospel of John, we encounter things like people talking about Jesus in Jerusalem, which is a primarily Jewish city. People who are there for a Jewish festival, talking about Jesus, who is himself Jewish, and debating whether he's really the Messiah. And then we're told that no one said anything openly about him for fear of the Jews. And you're like, what does that mean then? Well, the term Jews, we've indicated, linguistically, one possible meaning in some instances might be the Judeans, as opposed to the Galileans who maybe were more favorable towards Jesus or other things. But in some cases, it seems to be more like one of the ways we might use, in our own time, talking about the Americans. Right? If I were to say that if I were to seek citizenship of another country, let's say Romania, or pursue another citizenship, the Americans would, in all likelihood, revoke my citizenship, my American citizenship. Now, do I mean that you guys would all, come running up to me and start searching my pocket for my passport or something like that? Who am I referring to when I say the Americans in that context? Yeah, the government. And so the leaders of the Jewish people seem to be those who are in view here. And you'll often find that scholars will put the Jews in the Gospel of John in quotation marks, right? Like, it really is almost like scare quotes, because there seems to be an irony about the way the author of this Gospel is in it. Because it seems, from all the clues we have within this Gospel, that the author and the community that he's writing for are themselves Jewish Christians. And another clue we get within this Gospel is that there are 3 references to people becoming aposynagogues, right? Expelled from the synagogue or kicked out of the synagogue. And it's a term that we don't find in other works, right? Even where we have stories of conflict. And so it may be that the author of this Gospel calls his opponents and the opponents of Jesus the Jews precisely because they've recently undergone an experience where they, as Jews and as Jewish Christians, have been made clear to them that they're no longer welcome in their local Jewish community. And so those people who define themselves as the Jews and have defined us out. Right? And so the author may be using the term somewhat ironically. Throughout the Gospel of John, there are these debates and dialogues. And several authors have suggested that the Gospel of John reads like one long trial of Jesus. Right? So there are witnesses who are called, there are objections, there's testimony, and a lot of those terms that we associate with the court of law are found in the Gospel of John all throughout. And so there's not much of a trial of Jesus at the end, unlike in the Synoptic. And that may not be because the author's not interested in a trial of Jesus, but because basically the whole thing becomes a trial of Jesus. And so it may be that in response to some of those dialogues and debates that are going on in the author's time, that you get this developed Christology which depicts Jesus as the incarnation, right, to use the traditional Christian term, of one who pre-existed in heaven. Right? In John chapter 9, the Jewish opponents are depicted as saying, we know God spoke to Moses, but this man, we don't know where he comes from. Prior to the Gospel of John, there were already people referring to Jesus as the Son of Man, who's referred to in apocalyptic literature like Daniel and 1st Enoch. And there was a tradition of depicting that Son of Man as pre-existing in heaven. But it wasn't taken literally, as far as we know, prior to this time. But we can imagine this early Christian or somebody prior to his time reflecting in the context of a debate about Jesus' authority, about what Jesus could offer, right? Moses brought the law, Moses brought revelation of God, that was what Jews believed. Why should they listen to Jesus? What does he have to offer that Moses doesn't? And in that context, Christians might have begun to reflect on that language that they used, the language of pre-existence, and begun to develop it and take it more literally in response to those objections. And it may be that those debates spark some of these developments, and maybe that's why we find a lot of continuity between John and earlier authors, but with those ideas being developed in distinctive ways, which leads to essentially a unique gospel. So, some key points about the fourth gospel. It seems to have been written in a context of conflict by members of a Christian community who had been part of a local Jewish community, a Jewish synagogue, and had been expelled, had been made no longer welcome there. It has a unique style, distinctive content, distinctive order, distinctive portrait of Jesus. It's the only gospel to depict Jesus as conscious of having a prior heavenly existence. And it seems likely to me that there's a connection between the conflict that was going on over Jesus within that Jewish context of that synagogue before these Christians were expelled, and the unique way in which this Christian author depicts and presents Jesus in his gospel. So there you have the relationship between the four Gospels in a nutshell. The Gospel of John, there's a lot more debate about it because of the lack of overlap. Does it have a literary relationship with the others? Is it written independently? You'll find that that's one subject about which there are a lot of people who have strongly held views, but there's not a whole lot of consensus.